Advice on how to parent and teach boys. Hey, it's Prince of Queens, and although I am not a parent myself and have never actually worked as a teacher of youth, I have come to the realization that many parents and teachers with young boys are struggling to find good ways to parent and teach them. Christina Hoff Sommers wrote a book called The War on Boys that was published in 2001, well after the observable traits that feminism has implemented had a profound effect on child rearing in the Western world. And from what it would seem, the gradual push feminism has had on deeming typical boyish behavior as toxic masculinity has only increased since then. Now, although I'm an advocate for the gender-specific issues of men and boys and am very much not a feminist, I will concede that there is truth to the concept of quote-unquote toxic masculinity. Granted, toxic femininity is a thing too, but that's another topic for another video. Regardless, when I was a kid in grade school, there was a period where my friends and I would chase around this one kid during recess practically every day, yelling at him like we were gonna beat him up or something. We never actually did beat him up. It just seemed like fun to chase him around and call him names. However, looking back at it, it was tribalistic and shitty boy behavior that I wish somebody would have been able to get us to stop feeling inclined to participate in sooner. And considering how much I got picked on for being queer in middle school, I learned my lesson naturally. Similarly, as a small child, I got very little attention from my family members for complicated reasons that I don't want to get into, so I ended up being extremely loud and dramatic as a way of coping with the fact that I felt ignored and very lonely. I basically became obnoxious because I craved attention. This is something I can't say I have entirely gotten rid of, and girls definitely do this too, to a certain degree. However, just yesterday there was a story I saw online about some spring breakers chanting, "Build a wall," in Cancun, Mexico. And I couldn't help but imagine a bunch of guys, kind of like myself, who grew up craving attention, and then growing up to be undergraduate college aged, and still having that urge to act in socially inappropriate fashions based around a strange combination of repression and feeling that nobody cares about what you have to say or how you really feel. Sure, feminists and teachers that teach under the feminist influence model will tell you that they care about the feelings of boys, but what they really generally mean is that they will be sympathetic to a boy that starts crying because somebody hit him or hurt his feelings, and they won't shame him for crying. Seriously, feminist compassion for boys usually only goes so far as wanting boys to cry more often, though maybe not if he isn't cute or girly enough. Regardless, from my recollection of being a young boy with a lot of male friends and having a lot of male friends in adult life that I have talked to about our childhoods quite a bit, boys don't really want teachers and parents that want them to shut up and be obedient until they potentially might end up crying for some reason. If all you are offering boys is sympathy when they start crying, what are you forgetting about when raising your boys? You see, what I think boys really want is to be engaged with, be challenged, and to have the occasional audience that they can show off in front of. If boys get those things, chances are that it won't be super common that they'll end up crying, because those are the types of things that make boys happy. Let me tell you a story about the only good teacher I had in elementary school. I'll call her Mrs. Pallett. Aside from Mrs. Pallett, I am fairly confident that every teacher I had up through grade 5 thought that boys were a nuisance and would have preferred to be teaching a class entirely filled with girls. It would have made their lives easier if the boys just didn't exist, because these were generally classes of about 30 children, and since this was the 1980s and early 90s, third wave feminism was already seeping its way into the cultural zeitgeist, and culture was demonizing maleness. So I can imagine that overstressed female grade school teachers took out a lot of their frustration on the loud boys like myself, who were likely just crying out for attention that we didn't really get at home. However, Mrs. Pallett had a good system for dealing with the boys in her class. Mrs. Pallett, I'm pretty sure, was a lesbian, but the cool kind of lesbian that I think actually had a lot in common with men and boys. And she did one thing that I will never forget, something that profoundly changed my life, even to this day. You see, I had Mrs. Pallett in the 4th grade, just when kids my age were starting to get the hang of writing, which is something she apparently was well aware of. That being said, every day after our lunch recess, when we would get back with our blood pumping hard from running around the playground, she'd have us write silently for about 30 or 45 minutes. But even better than that, for the last 15 minutes, kids could share what they had written in front of the class if they wanted to, and it was completely fine to draw pictures to illustrate what we had written, just as long as there was one full sentence on every page. And we could write pretty much anything. She did not censor us. At the time, I thought that she was just having us practice English, but I realize now that it was much more than that. She was allowing students to be rewarded by acclaim from their peers for their imaginations, and even encouraging it. And she was super chill about the types of stories she'd allow. I would write stories where characters died all the time, just as a joke, and she thought it was funny. The next year, my teacher tried to do the same type of thing, but she was awful in terms of discipline and heavily favored girls. She kept censoring my stories and telling me that I couldn't write about certain things because they were inappropriate for whatever reason. I think really just because she hated me. Even though she literally allowed a girl to write an ongoing story about a serial killer. It was messed up shit. However, the good teacher, Mrs. Pallett, was not an authoritarian. What she understood that the other teacher had apparently never figured out was that if you allow young boys just a small window of complete freedom to express themselves however they want, and allow them to learn through trial and error what makes the other kids laugh or get excited, the kid can look forward to that period every day if they crave attention. If I ever did anything annoying in class and distracted from her teaching, all Mrs. Pallett had to do with me would be to say, "Prince, save it for story time, okay?" And I'd settle down, because I'd remember that I had a story time in an hour or two where I would have the class's undivided attention for a few whole minutes, and that even the teacher, Mrs. Pallett, enjoyed my stories and laughed at them a lot of the time. Had it not been for that class, I might have never ended up as a serious writer. I also might have ended up a completely 100% rebellious teenaged dropout, instead of a headstrong, wise ass who thought I was smarter than most of my teachers, but clicked very well with a few of them and worked very hard in the classes I enjoyed. You see, Mrs. Pallett taught me that despite what I might have thought from my other teachers and my lonely home life, plenty of people wanted to hear what I had to say. Maybe not all the time, but people did think I was entertaining enough that if I worked hard on my message, I would be listened to. That all said, not every boy enjoys writing or drawing. Not every boy probably even enjoys showing off. However, it's your job as parents and teachers to figure out what boys do enjoy and meet them halfway. If they like performing, find time for him to perform for you as much as possible. If they like guns and swords, find him an age-appropriate video game like the Lego Adventures with Indiana Jones. Don't just say that guns are horrible and that he isn't allowed to play with any violent toys, because then he'll end up with that repression that I spoke of earlier, and he might end up chanting, "Build a wall" in Mexico. If anything, as just a big fuck you to authority because you never let him be himself. That's all I have to say for this evening. Drop me a comment. Please help me out on Patreon if you think I seem cool, because I could use the money pretty bad right now. Hit the bell button next to the subscribe button so you don't get unsubscribed, and stay tuned.